Ancient Mesopotamia refers to the place where humans first formed civilizations. It was here that people first gathered in large cities, learned to write, and created governments. For this reason, Mesopotamia is often called the cradle of civilization. The word Mesopotamia means the land between rivers. When people say Mesopotamia, they are referring to a section of land in the Middle East between and around the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Today, this land is located mostly in the country of Iraq. There are also portions in southwestern Iran, southeastern Turkey, and northeastern Syria. The heart of Mesopotamia lies between the two rivers in southern Iraq. The land there is fertile, and there is plenty of water around the two major rivers to allow for irrigation and farming. Early settlers in Mesopotamia started to gather in small villages and towns. As they learned how to irrigate land and grow crops on large farms, the towns grew bigger. Eventually, these towns became large cities. New inventions such as government and writing were formed to keep order in the cities. The first human civilization was formed. The Sumerians were the first humans to form a civilization. They invented writing and government. They were organized in city-states, where each city had its own independent government ruled by a king that controlled the city and the surrounding farmland. Each city also had its own primary god. Sumerian writing, government, and culture would pave the way for future civilizations. The Akkadians came next. They formed the first united empire where the city-states of the Sumer were united under one ruler. The Akkadian language replaced the Sumerian language during this time. It would be the main language throughout much of the history of Mesopotamia. The city of Babylon became the most powerful city in Mesopotamia. Throughout the history of the region, the Babylonians would rise and fall. At times, the Babylonians would create vast empires that ruled much of the Middle East. The Babylonians were the first to write down and record their system of law. The Assyrians came out of the northern part of Mesopotamia. They were a warrior society. They also ruled much of the Middle East at different times over the history of Mesopotamia. Much of what we know about the history of Mesopotamia comes from clay tablets found in Assyrian cities. The Persians put an end to the rule of the Assyrians and the Babylonians. They conquered much of the Middle East, including Mesopotamia. Interesting facts about Mesopotamia. The Babylonian law, created by King Hammurabi, the Code of the Hammurabi, may be the oldest written law in the world. The Sumerians are often credited with inventing the wheel. At the center of each major city was a temple to the city's god called a ziggurat. The Tigris and the Euphrates rivers are both well over 1,000 miles long. Because this is where people first began to write, Mesopotamia is often called the place where history began. Mesopotamia is part of a larger area that archaeologists call the Fertile Crescent. Many of the buildings, walls, and structures were made from sun-dried bricks. These bricks didn't last long, so very little of ancient Mesopotamian cities still stand. Much of what we know about Mesopotamian history comes from thousands of clay tablets found in the library at the Assyrian city of Nineveh. Ancient Mesopotamia, Great Cities of Mesopotamia. Uruk was one of the first major cities in the history of the world. It reached its peak around 2900 BC when it had an estimated population of nearly 80,000 people, making it the largest city in the world. Uruk was located in southern Mesopotamia along the banks of the Euphrates River. It was the center of the Sumerian civilization. It was able to grow so large because of advanced farming and irrigation techniques. The abundance of food made the city rich. The most famous king of Uruk was Gilgamesh. He was later turned into a mythical hero through the tales of his exploits and superhuman strength in the Epic of Gilgamesh. The city of Akkad was the center of the world's first empire, the Akkadian Empire. The people of Akkad, under the leadership of Sargon the Great, conquered many of the Sumerian city-states and took control of Mesopotamia. The Akkadian language took the place of the Sumerian and continued to be the primary language of the region into the Babylonian and Assyrian empires. Archaeologists still haven't found the city of Akkad and are unsure where it is located. It was likely located in southern Mesopotamia, just east of the Tigris River. Assur. Located in northern Mesopotamia, on the western bank of the river Tigris, Assur became the first capital city of the Assyrian Empire. Although other cities would later take over as capital of the Assyrian Empire, Assur was also recognized as the religious center of the empire. Assur was named after the primary god of the Assyrians. The city and the god are sometimes called Assur. Babylon. Babylon was the capital city and center of the Babylonian Empire. During its peak, Babylon was the largest city in the world, with populations exceeding 200,000 people. It was home to kings such as Hammurabi and Nebuchadnezzar. As well as the fabled Hanging Gardens of Babylon, which are one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Babylon is located in central Mesopotamia along the banks of the Euphrates River. Today, the ruins of the city can be found around 50 miles south of Baghdad, Iraq. Babylon is mentioned several times in the Bible. Nimrud. Nimrud became the capital city of the Assyrian Empire in the 13th century BC. Although the city later fell into ruins, the great king Ashurnasirpal II rebuilt the city and made it the Assyrian capital once again in 800 BC. Nimrud was home to some of the most magnificent palaces built in ancient history. The palace of Shalmaneser III covered over 12 acres and had more than 200 rooms. Nineveh. The greatest city of the Assyrian Empire was Nineveh. It became the largest city in the world at the height of the Assyrian Empire. The city was largely built under the rule of King Sennacherib, around 700 BC. The Great Walls of Nineveh enclosed an area of 7 square kilometers and had 15 gates. There were 18 canals that brought water to different areas of the city. Nineveh was home to King Ashurbanipal, the last great king of the Assyrian Empire. Under his rule, a great library was built that housed over 20,000 clay tablets. Much of what we know about Mesopotamia is from these tablets. Nineveh is also famous from the story of Jonah and the whale from the Bible. In the story, God tells Jonah to travel to Nineveh, but Jonah refuses. Jonah then tries to run from God, but is swallowed by a great fish and spit out on the shore. Jonah then travels to Nineveh in obedience to God. Persepolis. Persepolis was the capital of the Persian Empire. The name is actually Greek for Persian city. The city was originally built by Cyrus the Great around 515 BC. Other kings such as Darius I and Xerxes completed the palace and other buildings. The city was located in southeast Iran. Much of the city is currently being reconstructed by archaeologists. Some of the structures include the Gate of Nations, the Throne Hall, and the Apandana Palace. With the start of the Sumerian civilization, daily life in Mesopotamia began to change. Prior to the growth of cities and large towns, people lived in small villages and most people hunted and gathered. There wasn't a lot of variety in jobs or daily life. With the growth of large cities, things changed. There were all sorts of jobs and activities. While many people still worked as farmers in the country, in the city a person could grow up to work in a number of different jobs such as priest, scribe, merchant, craftsman, soldier, civil servant, or laborer. With people moving to towns and governments being formed, society was dividing into different classes of people for perhaps the first time. At the top of society was the king and his family. The priests were considered near the top as well. The rest of the upper class was made up of the wealthy, such as high-level administrators and scribes. Below the upper class was a small middle class made up of craftsmen, merchants, and civil servants. They could make a decent living and could work hard to try and move up in class. The lower class was made up of laborers and farmers. These people lived a harder life, but could still work their way up with hard work. At the bottom were the slaves. Slaves were owned by the king or bought and sold among the upper class. Slaves were usually people who were captured in battle. Most people lived in mud brick homes. They were rectangular in shape and had 2 to 3 levels. The roofs were flat, and people would often sleep on the roofs during the hot summers. The mud brick worked as a good insulator to help to keep the homes a bit cooler in the summer and warmer in the winter. As the cities of Mesopotamia grew wealthy, there were more resources and free time for people to enjoy entertainment. They enjoyed music at festivals, including drums, lyres, flutes, and harps. They also enjoyed sports such as boxing and wrestling, as well as board games and games of chance using dice. The children of the time would have had toys to play with, such as tops and jump ropes. Art and poetry was a big part of the wealthier cities. Most of the poetry and art had a religious theme or honored the king of the city. Storytellers would have passed stories down over generations, with some of the more popular stories eventually being written down on clay tablets by scribes. Clothing was typically made from sheepskin or wool. The men wore kilt-like skirts, and the women wore longer dresses. They enjoyed wearing jewelry, especially rings. The women braided their long hair, while the men had long hair and beards. Both men and women wore makeup. The civilizations of ancient Mesopotamia brought many important advances in the areas of science and technology. Perhaps the most important advance made by the Mesopotamians was the invention of writing by the Sumerians. With the invention of writing came the first recorded laws called Hammurabi's Code, as well as the first major piece of literature, the epic tale of Gilgamesh. Although archaeologists don't know for sure who invented the wheel, the oldest wheel discovered was found in Mesopotamia. It is likely the Sumer first used the wheel in making pottery in 3500 BC, and then used it for their chariots in around 3200 BC. The Mesopotamians used a number system with the base 60, like we use base 10. They divided time up by 60s, including a 60-second minute, a 60-minute hour, which we still use today. They also divided up the circle into 360 degrees. They had a wide knowledge of mathematics, including addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, quadratic and cubic equations, and fractions. This was important in keeping track of records, as well as in some of their large building projects. The Mesopotamians had formulas for figuring out the circumference and area for different geometric shapes like rectangles, circles, and triangles. Some evidence suggests that they even knew the Pythagorean theorem long before the Pythagoras wrote it down. They may have even discovered the number for pi in figuring out the circumference of a circle. Using their advanced math, the Mesopotamian astronomers were able to follow the movements of the stars, planets, and the moon. One of the major achievements was the ability to predict the movements of several planets. This took logic, mathematics, and a scientific process. By studying the phases of the moon, the Mesopotamians created the first calendar. It had 12 lunar months and was the predecessor for both the Jewish and Greek calendars. The Babylonians made several advances in medicine. They used logic and recorded medical history to be able to diagnose and treat illnesses with various creams and pills. The Mesopotamians made many technological discoveries. They were the first to use the potter's wheel to make better pottery. They used irrigation to get water to their crops. They used bronze metal and later iron metal to make strong tools and weapons, and used looms to weave cloth from wool. Interesting facts about Mesopotamian technology. The walls of Babylon were once considered one of the 7 ancient wonders of the world. There were actually 2 massive walls that surrounded the entire city. Archaeologists estimate that the walls were over 50 miles long, with each wall being around 23 feet wide and 35 feet tall. There were also massive towers at intervals along the wall that may have been hundreds of feet tall. The Mesopotamians may have invented the simple machine called the Archimedes screw. This would have helped them raise water to the heights needed for the plants in the famous Hanging Gardens of Babylon. The Assyrians developed glasswork, as well as glazes for pottery and art to help it last longer. 18 different canals have been found that brought water to the Assyrian Empire capital of Nineveh.